I mean, if they do, I still won't
So
just.
I'm gonna start again. I think I'm on time now, 4:30. So I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Earl Tucker. I've been doing this annual Tisha B'Av for about 6 years now. And I originally thought about it because I wanted to look at Jewish history from a Jewish lens. My theory was that history was always written by those who were in power. Jews were never in power, so Jews never got any recognition for some of the great achievements in the world. And my first lecture was about Christopher Columbus, 1492, and the expulsion from Spain, which was a very good segue from Rabbi Becker, who just gave a great story about the Spanish Inquisition. And I looked at all of the variables that went into the idea that Christopher Columbus was a secret Jew, or a converso, or a Marrano, or whatever you want to call him. And I did a big mathematical regression analysis, and I had about 30 different variables, and I was able to put a strong argument together in my thesis that he had a strong probability of being Jewish. And last year, lo and behold, the Spanish government did DNA testing on Christopher Columbus, and it was determined that, in fact, he was a Sephardic Jew. So it all started right here in Aish Torah. I call this Tisha B'Av Live. So you get all the news live from here about Jewish history. So this year, first of all, I wanted to dedicate this class to a Aish Torah person who is suffering through chemotherapy and cancer. His name is Robert Gordon. He's a fellow Toastmaster. Usually he comes to this lecture, but he's not here, so I thought we would dedicate this learning in his honor to help him recover.
Is he up to having visitors? Because I did go once.
He is, yeah.
He's still up, okay.
Yeah, I just saw him walking the other day. He
Ah.
looks thin and white,
Yeah.
but he's doing as good as you can
Do you know his
expect.
Hebrew name?
I'm sorry?
Do you know his Hebrew
I
name?
do it
from
know.
before?
I have it
Okay.
know.
Yeah.
So this one's for Robert.
Okay. Okay.
So part of the reason, and these are my two books, I'm going to try to synthesize into one cohesive lecture. And one is called In the Days of the Second Temple, written by Jacob Gall, PhD in Jewish history. And the other book is called My Promised Land by Ari Shavit. And he is a journalist from Israel, a writer for Haaretz, a little bit there's another door over there, Elliot.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, maybe it'll be easier to get in.
Okay.
So he's a lefty writer from Haaretz who wrote this beautiful book. It's about 10 years old, and it was a New York Times bestseller. But it's a very well-written historical account of Israel, how it started from his great-grandfather or grandfather that came to Israel in the late 1800s, and the evolution of the Zionist state with names and dates and very detailed information about how Israel formulated in its early years. So I wanted to try to combine the old and the new, and I have to say that it was stimulated by conversations with a master in divinity from Tyndale College, which is just over here on Bayview. I met this very lovely ski girl. We went skiing and we started talking about religion, and then I found out she was a master of divinity, Christian, and we started to exchange thoughts about Judaism and Christianity, and I started to realize that as Jews, we only study Jewish texts, and there are Christian texts, which when you are confronted with them can be very confusing. So I thought I had to wrap my head around this a little bit to kind of understand where the confusion is and try to make a better understanding so that when other people are confronted, they will have a basis of understanding. So the Mr. Golub over there says that the Greeks gave the world art, the Romans gave the world law, the Jews gave the world religion. And that is our major contribution to society, among other things. So the story of the temples always struck me, and that's why I kind of was impacted by Tisha B'Av, because the first temple was built in 960 BC. It was destroyed in 586 BC by the Babylonians. And part of the reasoning they say is that the Kohanim were immoral. And that is why the Babylonians destroyed the temple, or the temple was destroyed. Jews have a tendency to say, I did something, therefore that happened. And that's the Jewish way of introspecting. The second temple, after the Babylonian return by King Cyrus from Persia, who felt that it was better for exiled people to go back to their country of origin so they will be happy, the Persian king allowed the Jews to go back to Babylonia, back to Israel, and they built the second temple. And the beginning of the second temple, it was not as beautiful a temple as everybody sees in the picture. That beautiful temple was actually made by King Herod in 20 BC. So there was phase 1, which was done by the Babylonians, and phase 2 by King Herod. And King Herod was known to be the architect of the Middle East. He did many beautiful structures, one of which was the expansion of the second temple. I call it phase 2. He built Masada, which was the fortress in the middle of the desert that was supposed to be impossible to conquer because there was nothing around it. He built Caesarea because there was no harbors that were safe along the coast of Israel, and he created the largest man-made harbor for shipping. And there's also amphitheaters, and now it's also a very luxurious place to live in Israel. And that was all King Herod who did this. And there's issues, he was Jewish, he was not Jewish. From what I understand, he was from a converted family. He was Jewish, and he had good contacts in the Roman Empire, and he became king of Israel. And through his architectural ambitions, he built many beautiful things. And when you go to the Temple Mount, those big bricks in the Western Wall, that's King Herod who put, you're looking at a retaining wall. So those are structural bricks that was done by King Herod in the time of the Second Temple expansion, phase 2, I call it. So if we look at the amount of time that the temples existed, from 960 BC to the year 70 Common Era, the Jewish temples lasted for 1,030 years. That's like a millennium. When you take a look and you compare it, the Greek Empire lasted 750 years. The Roman Empire lasted 500 years. However, if you look at the eastern part of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine area, they say it lasted 1,500 years. So in relative terms, those two temples were a significant period of classical history. And the destruction of the temples was significant because it created a vacuum in time and space. And what I want to argue now is that what were Jewish people doing in those temples? They were doing sacrifices, they were reading Torah, and when they were expelled from Babylonia, they were writing the Mishnah and Gemara. Jews were reading and writing about 3,000 years ago, where the Western Europeans only became literate in the 19th and 20th centuries. There were clergy and upper class people that were literate, but the Jewish population was far advanced in literacy, and it's my theory that this is what the temples did to make the Jewish people unique amongst the other people. And this is why Jews became the foundational parts of the Roman Empire, because they were good record keepers, they could read, they could write, they could count, they were accountants. And for the kings, they would write letters, and the letters were sent from one king to another king, and another Jewish person on the other side would read the letter because the kings were illiterate. I also argued that when Christopher Columbus sailed in 1492 during the Spanish Inquisition, the maps that he used were Jewish maps. Jews were known to be map makers, mathematicians, and all the astronomical tools used to navigate across the oceans were Jewish creations. So the temples were a religious institution, but they're also an institution of literacy. And because Jews were literate and most of the non-Jews were not, they were distrusted and they were peculiar, and these are part of the ideas of the causes of anti-Semitism. And they're also successful because they were literate and had these skills, and there was jealousy. So that's part of the institution of the two temples, creating literacy 3,000 years ahead of everybody else. So during the time of the Second Temple, and Professor Golub talks carefully, he said, who was this guy? Jesus. As it turns out, Jesus is a Greek name for the Jewish name Joshua. His name was Joshua, and I think the Jews call him Yoshka, but it's really Yehoshua. And as it turns out, he was the son of a carpenter, and he was doing outreach. He was doing outreach, and his target market was people that were poor and weak and needed health. And he got this very large following, and people were flocking to him because he had a very good personality and charisma, and people were getting healed, etc. And when King Herod passed away, the Romans raised taxes, and the Jews were suffering under oppressive tax regimes, and they were looking for a Messiah. And there were many false messiahs, like Rabbi Becher mentioned many times. He had Jesus right at the beginning. There were some other messiahs too, but there were false messiahs because the Jews were suffering and they were looking for an escape, and they were looking for the Messiah. And Jesus' followers said, he's the Messiah. And some people, he may have even said he was the Messiah. And the Romans became a little bit concerned that there could have been a political uprising. But the Jews brought him to the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin decreed that he was a false Messiah and brought him to the Romans, and then the Romans decided to crucify him. So that's what happened to our nice Jewish rabbi Jesus, and a lot of the rabbis don't like to talk about him because they say he caused a lot of trouble. He was a bit of a troublemaker, and I've meant to mention this. I said Jews in general, I call them, what's the word? Disruptors. That we as a society, we disrupt regular thinking. Abraham disrupted his father's idol business by breaking all the idols and saying, your idols are not real gods, it's all nonsense. There's one God, he's not visible, and he disrupted the idol industry. So Jesus disrupted what was going on as far as the Messiah, and he got brought to the Sanhedrin. They said, you're a fake. Romans took him out because they were more concerned about political stability. And the other part that they talks about is that the Romans actually wanted to do a deal with the Jews. They were more concerned with the Greeks, who were the very powerful civilization that they just displaced in Israel, and they wanted to get along with the Jews to have, to not have trouble because they were more worried about the Greeks. And the story goes, from what I read, is that there was this political uprising, which comes from this story, the Kochba, what is it?
Bar Kochba.
Not Bar Kochba, Kumza and Bar Kumza. This is a story that there was a guy invited to a fancy party. He was not welcome. He said, "Please don't embarrass me." The host embarrassed him. He got dragged out in front of everybody. And he says, "I'll pay for the whole party, just don't embarrass me." And they brought him out. He was embarrassed. And because of that, he went to the Romans and said, "The Jews are planning an uprising." The Romans decided to preempt the Jewish uprising, and that's what started the battle against the Jews, because of Kumza and Bar Kumza. And the story is, the reason that the second temple fell was because of baseless hatred, because of the way Kumza and Bar Kumza treated one another. That's why the second temple fell. According to this book, it was a mistake that the Roman soldiers started it on fire. They had no intention of destroying the temple, but there was an error and the temple burned down. So in this podcast that I listened to yesterday by it's called Call Me Back. I don't know if you listened to Dan Senior, and he had a Jewish lecturer called Rachel Paulin Goldberg, whose son was Hirsch Goldberg, who was the hostage that was killed. And she's a beautiful Jewish educator, and she talked about how the Tisha B'Av is one of those dates in history that nobody really knows about. But if you say to the class, "Where were you on 9/11?" everybody knows that date. It's etched in your mind. So Tisha B'Av is the Jewish 9/11, and I think the concepts are similar, because what the Muslim terrorists were trying to do on 9/11 was they attacked a symbol of Western capitalism. They attacked the World Trade Centers to try to destroy capitalism. And in the same way, the destruction of the first and second temples were a destruction of the Jewish idea of a monotheistic God. Now, yes, I was at a real estate seminar, and they asked how many people are immigrants to the country. Anybody not born in Canada? So
I was born in Montreal.
close. So the test goes like this. If you are not born in the country, one of the most important things you want to do to feel part of that country is to buy a home, so that you feel like you're a Canadian. And that when the real estate agent is calling you to see how you are, they're testing what's called the marker. The marker in you about your feelings, about your home, your connection to Canada, and that's a very touchy, emotional button for many people. So I look at the temples as our Jewish marker in the state of Israel. And when they destroyed the temples, there was a big vacuum within which things started to formulate. And that is where Christianity started to take root. It didn't happen immediately. It took 100 or 200 years for the books of Matthew, Paul, John, Luke to start to come together. And what I've been told is all of these guys are Jews that had Christian names. They were, the disciples. So, and because of the structure, the institution was destroyed, Christianity had the vacuum within which to take place. And when the Muslims destroy a civilization, the first thing they do is they put their mosque on top of previous civilization, so they now control the marker. So that is why the destruction of the temple led right into the growth of Christianity. And another idea is that Constantine, one of the Roman emperors, Christianity was illegal in Rome, and he allowed the legalization of Christianity, and he allowed to encourage it by making it less stringent than Judaism. So to be a Christian, you don't have to observe dietary laws. You don't have to have Brit Milah. You don't have to observe Shabbat. So it's a much easier religion to sell to the population. And if you take a look at the Titus Arch in Rome, you'll see the Romans taking the golden Calabria, the silver trumpets, and everything of value from the Second Temple was looted and moved its way to Rome. And so Constantine was able to make Christianity legal, move the center of Christianity to Rome. Hence, you have Roman Catholicism. And the Pope becomes the new spiritual head of Rome because they say Constantine felt that the Roman Empire would not last in its physical form, and they created this spiritual form headed by the Pope. And that's why when you see the Pope come out to speak, it's like an emperor. The whole world is like paying attention to what the Pope says. He's the modern Roman Empire, and caused by the destruction of the temple and the legalization and the growth of Christianity based on the fact that it was much less challenging to observe than Judaism. So I want to fast forward to the state of Israel. And I want to do a little bit of gematria. So the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492. In 1942, they were expelled 1492. In 1942, the Jews were in this checkmate situation. They had Rommel, the Nazi tank corps, coming across northern Africa, and the Rommel, they were called the Afrika Corps. And the Jews of Israel were afraid that the British army was going to abandon them and let them get slaughtered by the Nazi war machine. At the same time, in 1942, Auschwitz opened in Europe, as well as Belzec and Sobibor. March 30th of 1942, the first trains started to arrive in Auschwitz. So the young Zionists in Israel were caught in this crossfire with the Nazis coming across the northern Africa, Auschwitz and Belzec being opened, and as well the Mufti of Jerusalem had just made a deal, or he wanted to make a deal with Hitler, and he wanted to have concentration camps in Palestine to wipe out the Zionist state because he didn't want Jews in the state of Israel. So this psychology was needed some type of response, and a youth educator by the name of Shariahu Gutman, he was a 33-year-old hiking and mountaineering expert from Scotland, and he came upon this idea that he would change or try to change the psyche of the Israeli youth pioneer movement. And what he needed was a concrete symbol for Zionism to hold on to, because Zionism was not a religious movement. It was a secular movement, and there was no physical, tangible spiritual center. And his idea was to take them to Masada. And in those days, Masada hadn't been climbed or hiked in a couple of thousand years. There was no tram, there was no road, and he decided to take them on a hiking mission to the top of Masada using ropes and pitons and axes with heavy backpacks. And he took them to have kind of a bonding session and a spiritual and uplifting event on the top of Masada. And from those 42 youth leaders, they went into the youth movement and to change the collective psyche of the Hebrew youth. And because of that event, this IDF used to get sworn in on the top of Masada because they didn't have the Kotel until 1967. And in 1967, then the Kotel became in Jewish hands, and then the paratrooper brigades and other brigades would do their swearing in at the Kotel, but until such time, they were using Masada. And interesting enough, Masada was also designed, as I said, by King Herod. So in a way, it's part of the construction development team of King Herod. So I call the Masada experience the third temple, which is the temple for Zionism. And that became the focal point of the Zionist movement, which changed Jewish society because the IDF became the melting pot of all different Jews in Israel. And that is what makes Israel the startup nation, because you have young people that are being responsible for very expensive, high-tech military equipment, and the IDF becomes the core of all the startup companies that you see getting listed on NASDAQ and on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. It comes from Unit 8200, and many of these other high-tech units are in the IDF, and this is what is the foundational incubator for Israel's technology development. And a very important point is that Zionism is based on the concept that Zev Jabotinsky founded, which is called the Iron Wall. And the Iron Wall is the belief that Judaism or Zionism has to be so strong, so powerful, that nobody will dare to attack you. And Ben-Zion Netanyahu was the secretary for Zev Jabotinsky. He was a professor at, was it Cornell, did he say? He was a professor of history in the United States, but he was also the secretary for Zev Jabotinsky. And when we see Benjamin Netanyahu implementing his very strong attacks on the terrorist uprisings in Iran and Hezbollah, this is all part of the teachings that he learned from his father, Ben-Zion, about the Iron Wall. And that's the type of strategy that the IDF is using in the defense of Israel. So now I want to do a little bit of numbers and try to show a different picture about the future. So in 1939, there were 2.3 billion people in the world. In nowadays, in 2026, there's 8.3 billion people in the world. That's a 300% increase in population. In 1939, there were 200 Muslims. In 2026, there's 2.06 billion Muslims, a 930% increase. In 1939, there were 700 million Christians. 2026, there's 2.5 billion Christians, 194% increase. In 1939, there were 16.7 million Jews. In 2026, there's 15.7 million Jews. That means there's a negative 10% decline in Jewish population in the same period that the world's population has increased 300%. So the question is, if I was a business operator, I'd say something's wrong with the business. You know, the market has grown 300% and we're off 10 points. What did we do wrong? So I started to ask some questions. And of course, the first one that jumps out is the Holocaust. 6 million plus Jewish people murdered in the prime of their lives. It's taking us from, 80 years to almost get back to where we were. So the Holocaust was a very significant factor. However, one of the biggest factors, according to my associate in Israel, is assimilation, particularly in the United States and Canada. I just read, in Israel they call it the silent Holocaust. There is a 61 to 72% rate of assimilation in America, in the United States. A little bit less in Canada, about 23 to 33%. But a 72%. However, most of that is secular Jews. The Orthodox are showing an increase, and but the loss is in the secular world as well. So, and the secular world has, in North America, we have a very low birth rate, and there's also the high cost of being Jewish. The cost of kosher food, Jewish education, etc., is making it very onerous for Jewish people to be Jewish. And of course, one other thing, we have the finest soldiers that are being killed in these wars that we're fighting terrorism. And these are, the soldiers that go out in these combat units are some of the most sharpest, healthiest, competent people in the society. To be a fighter pilot, to be a paratrooper, to be a Nachal Brigade, Golani, these are the best of the best. And when you lose one of those soldiers, you're losing a very important lineage. And unfortunately, that's the big price that the Jewish people are paying for their self-defense. So, only 14% of Jews are converted into Judaism. So we have a very low conversion rate. We have a very high assimilation rate. However, the Orthodox community has only got like a 2% assimilation rate. And the ultra-Orthodox, such as the Haredi, their growth rate is about 3.5 to 4% per annum, and is expected to be 25% of Israel's population by the year 2050. The problem with the Haredi is they don't serve in the IDF, and they don't pay taxes. So this is why you're seeing the Israeli government starting to arrest Haredim who don't show up for their service. And there's discussion that I'm hearing that they're going to start to revoke their right to vote. Because if you've got this huge bubble of people that don't serve, when the country needs them and they should have their vote, they can create political parties that can make it very impossible for the country to exist. So in 1939, Jews were 0.72% of the world's population. In 2026, we are 0.2%. So we've dropped we're about a third as important as we once were numerically. And when it comes to Canada, the problem with Jews is we are a very small number. So when it comes to political votes, a lot of the politicians are not concerned. We're only a few ridings. There's only 400 Jews in Canada out of 40 million people. So we are less than 1%, virtually statistically insignificant. And that's the problem that we are having into the future. And the question remains, how do we reduce assimilation in North America and stop that flow? So I just want to end with a final quote that says, "What has God been doing since he split the Red Sea?" It's according to a book on Jewish weddings. It says he's been trying to make weddings. Thank you very much.
Yes, of course, yes, of course.